This is his first time at the X conference, but you'll probably see him again here for sure. He's going to get into some, again, very troubling, disturbing, disquieting things, and you'll probably need to take, some kind of sedative afterwards. But you understand, the truth is never, it's sometimes painful. So here, my good friend John Greenewald Jr. with some more truth for you.
What I want to do today is kind of take you on a little bit of a tour on what the U.S. government does say. As Steve mentioned, I created a website and an archive of documents to show not really my opinion on the subject of UFOs and multiple different subject matters that I deal with, but to kind of show you the raw evidence and show you the actual documents that the U.S. government really sends out. And the Black Vault was a website that I thought of almost 9 years ago. In August, it will be 9 years, which has been quite a long trek, as you'll be able to see. So when I was asked to speak here, and he said, summarize those 9 years and prove the cover-up in 50 minutes, I laughed, because there's just a massive amount of information to go through. So the archive was growing, and I was seeing the interest of the public growing in the subject of UFOs and government secrecy as a whole. To give you an idea, in March of 2005, this year, I served over 266,000 people that actually came to the site to download information. Now that number proved to me, well over 250,000 people, that, hey, you know what, people want this information. You don't have to register, or the site's free, 100%. I didn't believe in charging to learn. So we have almost 30,000 people that voluntarily registered just to take part in a message forum, which is now approaching 400,000 posts of people communicating all over the world.
What's your URL?
It's called blackvault.com. 113 gigabytes for computer guys like me was downloaded that month, and it grows every month. And as you can see by the graph, I just threw that on there, that every month it gets higher. And that proved to me, you know what, people want this information. People want to know the truth behind UFOs. And that's what I want to accomplish, is kind of show you why. They see some of the documents that the government sends out. It's 100% legal. Anybody can do it. I wasn't anybody special who was able to get this information sent to me in an envelope secretly. This was something that I legally did, and the only difference between what I was trying to accomplish and many of the other requesters was I had to learn the very difficult game of being patient. Because if you're not patient, the U.S. government just loves that, because you'll give up. And that was one of the hardest lessons for me to learn when I was 15. And I was still in high school trying to take on the CIA and the Pentagon, the FBI. And they quickly learned who I was, because I would send out these Freedom of Information Act requests by 30 or 40 at a time. I would put them in the mail. So all of a sudden, the Pentagon would get 15 letters from me, all requesting all sorts of different information. And as I was doing that, people were just coming in and just loving the information, because most of it was never out before. When you deal with the government, you deal with a very basic explanation for what UFOs are. And it all begins with something we've heard a lot about called Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book is rather boring, if you ask me. I'm tripping over here, sorry. It's rather boring, because the government summarizes from their research from 1947 to 1969, saying that this was their official explanation, and we know the story, that the government says there was nothing to UFOs. They've said that ever since. They summarized all those many years of research into a 2-page document. It's called the United States Air Force Fact Sheet. I bring this up in every lecture that I give, because this is the basic fundamentals of their explanation. This is it. This is the end all. This is what they want you to believe. The stats in Project Blue Book and outlined in this fact sheet are the following: that they did over 12,600 sightings that they investigated. All but 701 were all identifiable. They were all Earth-based objects. They could easily explain them away, and we all know the infamous swamp gas story and how the planet Venus mysteriously streaks through the sky and makes a right-angle turn, which I learned probably wasn't possible, but the government said it was. All UFO investigations were stopped in 1969. This is key. This one line is the basic. This is the basis for my entire research. in 9 years, I used this fact sheet to say the government's lying. It's not hard. You can do that in a minute or two. But just showing the information in 50 minutes is where the difficulty comes in. The best statement of all in this fact sheet is they want you and me to believe that no government agency has ever taken an interest in UFOs since the closure of Project Blue Book. This is it. This is what the government wants you to say. Anybody can get this. You just write them a letter. You can even give them a phone call and see what the truth is behind UFOs, and they'll send you this fact sheet, and they hope you'll give up. And back when I was 15 years old, I got this fact sheet, and I thought, okay, well, that's interesting, because some of the other documents I was starting to come in, that were starting to come into my mailbox, which were making my parents kind of nervous, but they were starting to flood in, was completely contradicting what the US government wanted me to believe. So this really, keep this in mind, keep this whole slide in mind. No government agency has ever taken an interest. I've dealt with subjects like nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, the secret testing of biological weapons on humans, some really secret and controversial stuff. It's actually harder for me to research and get UFO documentation than it is to get a nuclear bomb secret. Why is that? This is a little bit of an excerpt from the fact sheet that one agency actually went to the trouble to highlight other government agency. No other government agency. They were stressing this. And to me, it just further proved that they were trying, it was like they were setting themselves up to look bad. They were setting themselves up that they weren't telling the truth. You know, they said, hey, John, look over here, and they highlighted this statement. Yet I would get reams and hundreds of pages from another agency that completely contradicted it. You know, when I was very young, I didn't know the expression, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. When I was 15, I quickly learned what that meant, because they were doing the same research. They were doing the same things. They didn't explain the same subjects the same way. The Phoenix Lights incident was another way where Pentagon says one thing and the Air Force says another. You know, and it's just they don't do their homework right. It's like they're setting themselves up for this. I've dealt with agencies all over the map, all over the globe, and even the White House itself. It was quite a trek for me to try and figure out how the US government worked. I mean, I traced through the FBI, the CIA, I traced through all these guys, trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the role? What is the role that these guys play in the research? And it was like they all had information on the subject of UFOs. Project Blue Book stuff was all the easily explained material and so on. That was not the most interesting stuff. Because what I was coming up with was not in 1969, well, that's it, no UFO documents exist. It actually kept going. Here's a couple of them. This is the interesting part of it, though, is that when you look at these things, you have to remember, these are from the last 10 years. We're not dealing with the 50s or 60s anymore, or the 40s or anything like that. We're dealing with stuff in the last decade. Yet the US government still thinks that this unidentified flying object data is still classified top secret. Here's a couple more. They would actually spend so much money in ink that they adopted using black sheets of paper that they would just cut out and put across the whole paper and then just photocopy that, so you saw absolutely nothing on the page. So my question to that is why? And you'll hear me ask that question a lot throughout this, because I just don't know. It's hard for me to figure out why this subject is so classified. I just showed you 4 documents. I think anybody that looks at these things can really determine, okay, there's something to this. There's hundreds of pages that look exactly like this, all classified, still to this day. The only reason I have them is because all the classified information is blacked out. This is what the Freedom of Information Act is bringing me in 9 years. This was one of the first things that I got, and I knew, you know what, I'm on to something big. As I traced through the government, I thought one of the most natural places to check was at Peterson Air Force Base, the Space Command. And I found an interesting find in a tower log. And it was in, I have the copy of the handwritten log, and I also have their typed up response, or the typed up version of that. And it says the following: received call of UFO sighting at Griffiths Air Force Base, New York. 4 enlisted men observed circular orange light just above tree line east-southeast of their location. 5 minutes total hovered and then disappeared. I got this from the Air Force, who told me from their headquarters that you won't find any references to UFOs anymore because all the documents were transferred. They were transferred to the possession of our National Archives, which I was just at on Friday and had a great time. But they try and tell you, nope, the Air Force doesn't have anything. Why? Because you'll give up. They didn't want me to turn around and send the same request to Peterson because all of a sudden I came up with something. That showed it. They're not doing their homework. The most interesting part about it was 1996. Whoever these Air Force guys were that saw this felt the need to report it, so obviously we're dealing with some kind of issue over an Air Force base. But on top of that, the government had a procedure to actually archive this and keep it. They obviously wanted it. I have no problem with that. I don't think that blows open any huge conspiracy, but it proves the cover-up. Why would they cover all this stuff up? What is so special about the UFO subject that's so classified where they black everything out and they try and lie to you and say, no, we don't like it, but they're still collecting the records? So I did a little bit more research on, okay, how are these reports coming in? And I came across something that's been in the UFO community for many years that was called JANAP 146E, and it stands for Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146. Now, I'll tell you on a side note, if it's hard enough to learn how the government works, it is as equally, if not harder, to learn the acronyms. The Department of Defense has a book, a manual, that lists every known acronym that the DoD uses. Want to take a stab at how many pages it is? It's about 600 or 700 pages. Those are all the acronyms. So you read these things, it's like a foreign language. You're trying to translate them, and you don't know what it's trying to say. You know? So anyway, I came up with JANAP 146, and like I said, it's been around for a long time. In it, you learn how to report certain sightings. They call them service reports, another acronym. It stands for Communication Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings. And let me tell you, it does get confusing when you're dealing with all these acronyms. But this publication will tell you to report missiles, hostile and unidentified submarines, hostile and unidentified groups of military, and UFOs was the number 3 on the list. I know it's 4 on my slide, but in the actual publication is unidentified flying objects. So this was kind of during the Blue Book era, so that was kind of a standard thing that these Air Force, Navy, both Canadian government and US government pilots were seeing these UFOs and actually reporting them. So I looked in this manual, and it tells you to take the sightings that you see, the UFO sightings, or better known as service reports, and forward them to one particular agency, NORAD. NORAD has been the retrieval agency for all of the UFO documentation made under this JANAP 146E. So I sent a letter to NORAD. And they came back with a very interesting response. They said, NORAD is a binational command established by Volume 33, United States Treaties, page 1277, subject to control of both Canadian and U.S. government agencies as defined in the Act, and consequently is not subject to the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. How convenient was that? Well, we're going to start collecting all these UFO records, but let's not tell the public. Let's send them to the one agency that is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. They did that. I found 2 places. On a side note, the next one is the White House that is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. So, I did this big exchange with NORAD, and I just actually sent Stan Friedman some of the exchange that I had with them, and they did tell me that they had no idea what JANAP 146E was, which didn't make sense to me, and they asked me for a copy. And I wrote them back, and I said, here's the address to the DoD. That's where I got it from. And I gave them an excerpt, which I made it really simple, and retyped it, sent it to them, and said, look, it says you guys are receiving these reports. As far as I knew, JANAP was still on the books. So in 45, 50 years, nobody reported any of these sightings. How scary is that? But the NORAD said, hey, no, we don't collect that. Well, I found it interesting because this line in here, Canadian and U.S. government agencies, it's under the control of both. Well, my interest was kind of piqued when I read that a year after I got this letter. It took me a year to figure it out, that maybe it's not the U.S. government I have to go through. Maybe it's the Canadian government. Maybe they, since they're under the control of NORAD also, maybe they might be open too. It was a long shot. So I called them on the telephone. I was impatient. I didn't even want to wait. Called the Department of National Defense of the Canadian government to try and figure out, okay, you guys collect these service reports. Is there anything that I can get? So I get this guy on the telephone. He did not know my name. I didn't tell him what I was looking for. I just introduced myself as like a researcher, didn't give him my name, and I said, sir, I'm actually wondering, and I'm sorry, I skipped a step there. I learned that the Canadian government has an equivalent to the Freedom of Information Act. It's called the Access to Information Act. And that's what I wanted to call up and see if a U.S. citizen could use it. So called him up and asked him on the telephone. And he says, well, yeah, I guess if the information's been released, I don't see why not. I said, okay, great. I said, well, tell you what. I said, I'm looking for these reports, that, and I didn't expect him to know what it was. And I said, they're called service reports or communications instructions. He interrupts me mid-sentence. He says, oh, yeah, I know what they are. He says, I got them right here. And I almost fell off my chair, and I said, I'm sorry. And he says, oh, yeah, I like to keep these things handy. This is the Department of National Defense in Canada telling me this, and I'm on the phone, and I'm starting to sweat going, okay, I need these things. How can I get these things? So I asked him, I said, okay, how can I get a copy of them? And he says, well, you got a visa? And I said, well, yeah, I don't leave home without it. And I pulled it out and gave him the card and said, out of curiosity, how much you charge me? How many are there? And he says, about 100. So I was like, oh, okay, well, how much is he charging me? It was the best $4 I ever spent in my life. I mean, it was great. So I got all this information a couple of weeks after from the Department of National Defense. There were 100% UFO sightings. There wasn't any unidentified missiles or anything like that I went through. They were all UFOs. And there was even actually a crop circle report in the Canadian government files, which I thought was very interesting. And so I'm reading these things going, my God, this is proof. I mean, these things have to, by the book, by the law, these things have to go to, they're either housed at or channeled through the NORAD installation. But I've got a signed letter. I've got multiple ones saying, we don't know what JANAP 146E, and on top of that, we don't collect these. They even told me in one letter, in good faith, which I don't really know what that means. When they say, in good faith, we did an exhaustive search of records at our office. Now, I've been to the archives. I know what an exhaustive search is, and I guarantee they didn't do it in a couple days that they claim they did it. And they said, we found nothing on UFOs. NORAD is not in the business of collecting those. And they sent me that infamous fact sheet, which I've gotten from almost every government agency that existed. So why do I have these signed letters? Because the Canadian government now contradicted it. The Canadian government also sent me something else that was rather interesting. They sent me a copy of a manual that was part of their commercial, it was their equivalent to the FAA, their commercial airline pilots and what they follow. And I don't have the exact number, but it's on the books over there. Anybody can find it. They talk about service reports and how to identify and report a UFO, or not identify, but how to report a UFO. And these are the commercial pilots now. So now I have the military version, but now I just found the commercial version. But to me, as I'm now a couple years into my research, I'm about 19 at this point, I'm going, okay, wow, all right. So if the Canadian government's equivalent to the FAA is reporting these UFOs, I never thought of checking our own FAA. I thought that was kind of interesting. So I did a little bit of research. And as Steve said, the power of the internet is very, very just unbelievable. That I came up, I missed a slide there, with an FAA manual, 7110.10N, Flight Services, Chapter 6, Section 5, Subsection 6, Paragraph D, cites, references JANAP 146E. That they're supposed to actually, if you see it, JANAP 1 for the bottom line, JANAP 146E should be in all facilities. So obviously this publication is very important to the commercial airline industry. Well, where do those UFO reports go to? Well, by the book, they go to NORAD. So now I've got proof that the military is currently reporting these things, channeling them through NORAD. Now I've got additional proof that also the commercial airline pilots are channeling these things through NORAD. Yet NORAD says they don't know what I'm talking about. Well, I kept looking because I wanted more. I couldn't sleep at night. I had to keep going at it because I knew I was on to something. I knew that something was there to be found. Now, before Google was bigger than Alta Vista, at the time I was using Alta Vista, and I searched for surveys, see what I can come up with. A lot of references to JANAP 146E, a lot of material to find on many UFO websites. It wasn't an earth-shattering thing, but I came up with something very interesting on response number 20. It says Air Force Instruction 10-206, but it came up with surveys. And I was like, Air Force? What's the Air Force Instruction 10-206? I did a search around. Many in the UFO community had never heard this before. So I was like, okay, well, what is this? So I tried to go to the website, and it was down, mysteriously. They revamped their whole database, and I couldn't get it, so I had to do the laborious Freedom of Information Act request again and wait a few weeks, and they informed me, well, yeah, if you need it, you got to pay like 20 bucks. And that was the second best $20 I ever spent, because I got Air Force Manual 10-206. Chapter 5 was the bingo. It mentioned the surveys. And then in 5.4, that paragraph, it said where to send them to. And if you can see, the U.S. Air Force, now we're not dealing with any other government, this is particularly the U.S. Air Force, they're sending them to the NORAD. This was it for me, but I'll give you one more convincing thing. Unidentified flying objects was still in it. And the manual was dated October 4th, 2004. So my question is, after all these years of fighting and trying to make sense of the government archives, they have on the books a UFO reporting procedure, sending it to an agency that's already lied to me, sent from the headquarters of somebody who's already lied to me, and I've proven beyond any shadow of a doubt the UFO presence is all over. This was it for me. I mean, this kind of was like the tell-all, okay, you know what, that's, phew. So the last 15 minutes of what you just heard took 2.5 years to complete. So when I go back to the original statement of you have to learn patience, that's why. I got a letter about a month and a half ago. It says, "Dear Mr. Greenewald, this is in response to your Freedom of Information Act request dated, I think it was March 30th, 1996. That's another game that they play. You know, you might wait years for some of these documents to come. You have no idea what type of games the government wants to play. You know, I'm playing by their rules. It's a game they wrote. If they don't want to give me something, they're not. So it's trying to play a game with the bully on the schoolyard who made up the game and wants to win, and he's not going to let you win. And that's where I call it passion or determination comes from, because I don't want them to win. They wanted me to give up, and let me tell you, I almost did, because it was just frustrating. That actually sparked going into other subjects than UFOs, which is probably a good idea. So as I was waiting for UFO data, I would just be going hog wild and requesting, you know, biological weapon material or some top secret aircraft. And my dad works for a government contractor. So me doing that kind of work made him a little nervous in the beginning. And many ask, you know, what my parents are, what they feel about this. My mom's always been my biggest fan, but Dad, I always have to point him out now because he was so nervous in the beginning, and he wasn't so sure about this, and that's how I got junior. I'm not legally a junior, but I had to adopt a junior so Dad didn't, you know, freak out. And now today, he's one of the most active users on my message forum. He loves it, and he goes on there and shares information. So he's always been supportive. So as I was digesting the material from the Air Force, I thought to myself, why not look for another nugget? Why not look for something else that would just take the beyond the shadow of the doubt theory and just push it over the top? And I did. I started researching the individual pilot manuals for all the aircraft in the military. Searched through them and was very surprised to find that service was in almost every manual of planes that fly in the military in the sky today. The C-130, the F-117, which is commonly mistaken for a UFO, and the C-12, as you can see, the bottom references Air Force Manual 10-206, all how to report UFOs. So these individual pilots must be seeing them too. Here's a list of more manuals that I found. All of these manuals specifically mention exactly what I just talked about, all of them. And I could keep going. You know, I could create another slide with more aircraft and so on. And to me, that was it. It was over the edge, because this proved to me the Air Force was covering it up. Big surprise. As I've been talking about the games here with the U.S. government, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is an interesting one to bring up. The reason is because this was the home for Project Blue Book. Remember the basis for all of this. That they were the retrieval agency for all these UFO records from 47 to 69. They were the ones that housed all the information. Now, according to the U.S. Air Force, and as you can see here, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, they transferred all the records to the National Archives. They say, for information pertaining to Project Blue Book or UFOs, please contact the National Archives and Record Service at the address highlighted in the attached, quote, fact sheet. Now, you know, you'll see me do sarcastic quotes through something, and they did it the same way with the fact sheet, because they don't believe it either. I don't think they really believe that there's one fact on this thing, you know, and I found that humorous. But on top of it, I read an article in UFO Magazine, just by chance I opened it up a few years ago. Saw a little blurb on the side. Headline was, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base releases almost 1,000 pages on UFOs. And I read this thing and I was like, you got to be kidding me. The release authority was the same guy who signed the bottom of this letter. Right? In this, he says he did an exhaustive search. Now, I'll ask you, did he? No. So he found 1,000 pages and released them all. He sent me a bill for $200 or whatever outrageous amount it was, and I got him. It was the same old Project Blue Book stuff. There wasn't anything bad in there. But this proved to me something bigger. This proved to me that the U.S. government will claim, hey, we did an exhaustive search. And I know how hard it is, trust me. I'll even side with them on some of this because it is exhaustive. It really is. I just don't believe they're doing it. And by law, they kind of have to. That's what they do. So in a way, I believe it and side with T. Sergeant Husselman, who signed this letter, that he did an exhaustive search, and then all of a sudden he popped out 1,000 pages. That told me that government agencies are really not doing what they're doing, or supposed to do. They're not doing what they're claiming. And that, to me, was the bigger picture to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. One of the biggest things that the U.S. government will say is that UFOs pose absolutely no national security threat to the American public. That's one reason why they don't pursue any of this data, or so they claim. We proved obviously otherwise, but this is what they'll say at a press statement or a podium, No, we don't care. They're not a national security threat. They're all Earth-based objects, or, a comet or meteorite, or whatever explanation they want to give it. So we're dealing with one agency and one agency only, the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense. You can completely contradict their entire stance on the subject of UFOs. And I found this humorous. I just was going through this a couple months ago. I got these years ago, scanned them, had them online, but I wanted to do something a little different and deal with this, the national security threat. So in this package, right, you don't get them in file folders and have little tabs that say, okay, this is this and this is this. No, the government just photocopies a stack of paper and then just sends you the whole box, and you got to go through it and actually organize it to however you want. So when I put documents online, I'll give an index, but I keep it in the exact order that the U.S. government gave me. I've always wanted to keep that right. And the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, their package started with the infamous United States Air Force fact sheet on UFOs. There was one on there on the Philadelphia experiment, and they said, no, nothing's involved with the Philadelphia experiment. And they go through that UFOs pose no national security threat. There was like 3 versions of the fact sheet. It's like, okay, guys, I get your point. You don't want to admit to this. But if you keep thumbing through the same package of material, you come up with a event where UFOs were seen at Malmstrom Air Force Base, shutting down radar sites and causing a problem. To me, that's a national security threat. I don't care what the UFO is. That was national security. It didn't end there, because there was another one that was at Loring Air Force Base, also a problem. They called this an unidentified helicopter. But the problem was this all came up under my UFO request. Why they sent me, if this was a helicopter or whatever, they knew what I wanted. So they sent me this. I don't know if I should read into that or not. Here's another one from Loring Air Force Base. They had a problem where these UFOs were buzzing at Loring Air Force Base. To me, that's a national security threat. On top of that, that same report, as you can see, about a quarter of the way down on the distribution list, the White House itself was receiving these reports that were from 1975. Only 6 years after the closure of Project Blue Book, but they felt the need to make sure that the U.S. president kept apprised of everything that was going on. To me, that's a national security threat. How about this one? From Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico in '76. 2 UFOs are reported near the flight line at Cannon Air Force Base. Security police observing them reported the UFOs to be 25 yards in diameter, gold or silver in color, with blue light on the top, a hole in the middle, and a red light on the bottom. Air Force is checking with radar. Additionally, checking weather inversion data. This is a national security threat. I don't think we have to be a rocket scientist to figure out, hey, you know what? This is a national security problem. I'll throw in another one. Eglin Air Force Base also sees UFOs poses a national security risk over these radar sites. There's a problem here. I've only dealt with 24 months, only one agency proving the national security problem involving this subject, coming a few years after the closure of Project Blue Book, but the U.S. government wants to stand strong and say, nope, we don't collect these things and there's nothing to it. I've stayed away from the Roswell incident for quite some time. I used to get tons of letters to me every day about, well, what do you think about Roswell? And what do you think about Roswell? And Stan Friedman, who I always reference, has been a personal friend of mine for many years, and he does a great job. What am I going to do? Come in and find something. There's not, I couldn't do that. He's done an excellent job of doing this, and for many years has been determined in finding out the truth. So I listened to him when he talked about Roswell. But I thought, okay, well, tell you what, why don't we just deal with what the U.S. government says, their quote-unquote fact sheet on the Roswell incident. And they've gone through not one, not two, not three, but actually 4 different explanations, all contradicting each other on what the Roswell incident was. Now, that's really going to convince the public what the truth is. I'm sure maybe in 2010 we'll come up with another explanation. It'll be the Roswell report, case almost closed. That's where they're going to come out with something else. So they sent out in 1997 the Roswell report. I thought it was case closed, but I saw it referenced at the National Archives as something different yesterday, or on Friday. But this explanation, which again was a few hundred pages, tried to explain what the Roswell incident was. And they explained the bodies, and they explained the wreckage, and they explained all that stuff. Well, I didn't want to read it. I won't lie. I can't lie to you. It was boring. Some of these things are just tedious. And I opened it up and going, what, I have to go through this, to learn what the government yet again wants to prove to me. It was like, all right, forget it. But I stumbled across the executive summary. The executive summary takes this and puts it into this. So that was more my cup of tea. And I said, okay, well, I'll take a look at this. And I read through it. And luckily, in the first couple pages, they give you bullet points that summarize the summary. So I was very excited about that. Let's go through them. We know the newspapers. And we've seen the Pentagon. Quote, aliens observed in the New Mexico desert were actually anthropomorphic test dummies that were carried aloft by U.S. Air Force high-altitude balloons for scientific research. The, quote, unusual military activities in the New Mexico desert were high-altitude research balloon launch and recovery operations. Reports of military units that always seemed to arrive shortly after the crash of a flying saucer to retrieve the saucer and, quote, crew were actually accurate descriptions of Air Force personnel engaged in anthropomorphic dummy recovery operations. Claims of alien bodies at the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital were most likely a combination of 2 separate incidents. The first, a 56 KC-97 aircraft accident in which 11 Air Force members lost their lives, and a 1959 manned balloon mishap in which 2 Air Force pilots were injured. And don't ask me why this got cut off, but the last and best statement of all was this report is based on thoroughly documented research supported by official records, technical reports, film footage, photographs, and interviews with individuals who were involved in these events. My question is, I know the people who actually have interviewed all of the first-hand witnesses. They come up with a completely different story. I'm curious what documents they looked at, what records, what interviews, and what they tried to investigate the Roswell incident, how they did that. Problem is, it's pretty blatant. Let's go back a slide. A 1956 and a 1959 incident that explains the bodies. There's a problem with that one too. Roswell happened in 1947. There's a problem there. Well, the Pentagon did make a statement about that, and it's believable that each and every one of the hundreds of witnesses to the Roswell incident, they all got their dates mixed up. So don't worry about it. There's nothing there. There's also another problem with it. The crash test dummies that were used, they weren't used until 1952. So when you were trying to determine one conspiracy, we actually solved one. Okay, 1952, but we've uncovered another one. Time-traveling crash test dummies. From 1952, they were thrown out of a plane, traveled back to 47. We saw them, they went back, and this is what we determined. In research also, Area 51 I think is always fun to talk about, especially when you can get the government to officially acknowledge the base that doesn't exist. And about 2 years ago, I actually got them to do just that. I've received a couple references to Area 51. The first of which I think was a very interesting document, came from 1962, and actually references, as you can see, the subject, aerial observation of Area 51. And this was actually a cool story. Now, what they were doing was, obviously, the base of Area 51 was very well into operation right now, and they were doing whatever they were doing there. When the Corona satellite went up, one of our first spy satellites that went in the air, our data analysts were getting things that they've never really seen before. They don't really know what's going on. So the National Reconnaissance Office developed a project that would take the pictures over Area 51 and send them to our data analysts, but don't tell them it's Area 51, and see if they can actually figure out what was going on at the base. Now, as that's a fun historical story, this proved, okay, well, in '62, operations at Area 51 were very much well underway. Here's a close-up of that. But it says the 38,400-acre land, once known as Area 51, was withdrawn from public use by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission more than 35 years ago. Skipping down, today that land area is used by the Department of Defense. So if anybody follows the stories of Area 51 and the Department of Defense saying, no, we don't do anything over there, but the Department of Energy is telling me, yeah, the Department of Defense, they own and operate that thing, and they're still doing operations over there. And again, it goes right back to that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. They just don't know. They don't do their homework. They don't cooperate on the information. Hey, guys, if you say this, make sure you don't say that. And they don't do that. With Area 51, it was a prime example. These I threw in for fun, just in case anybody was sleeping, so I want to make sure you guys are paying attention. I actually did go out there a few years ago and had security follow me around. Was out there with a buddy of mine who snapped this picture. I went all the way to the border. Picture doesn't do its justice. I didn't want to take a nice digital camera out there because I've heard the rumors that they, come and get it from you. But they, I could pretty much just see the whites in their eyes. I was, close to this car. It doesn't look like that in the picture. So my buddy snaps a picture, and I turn around and I go, okay, I've done enough trouble. Turn around, I hear an engine start, and I go, oh, no, that's not good. So he actually pushes all the way down this road, which would come down to where the signs were, and I said, well, that's it. The Black Vault's going to jail. But they didn't, so I tried to cause more trouble and snapped one more picture before we hightailed it out of there and got away. But I was there that night to try and see if I could find anything, but nothing was there. So that's just a fun story. This is different, and this was also to test if you guys were awake. That's a moldy sandwich. And the reason why I threw this in there was it's a fun story. This goes with the government does not know what they have. We have this Freedom of Information Act, and as you've seen some of my discoveries over 9 years of research. We can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt there's a cover-up. There's obviously a conspiracy. They're obviously lying. We can prove all of that. When I first started this, even when I first lectured, I stayed away from the L word. I didn't want to say they were lying. I didn't want to be accusatory. But I used nothing but their own documentation. I'm not using anything that doesn't come straight from their own words. Well, this story actually proves it. A couple years ago, there was an initiative at the Department of the Army to try and get some more documents declassified. They were sorely behind at declassifying this data. So what they did was they tried to create a production line type of scenario where they would have some intern or some guy pull a box and slap a barcode on it and then send it down the line. Team B would actually get it, scan the barcode, and start creating a database of what all this documentation is in hopes that as it goes down the line, people are pulling it out, looking at it in hopes to declassify it and have the Army get out of the heat of some of the fire that was going at them because they weren't being open with the public. This was during the Clinton administration. So as this guy's dancing behind me, I'm sure you're wondering why. As in, one of the boxes that was brought down was labeled top secret. So they slapped a barcode on it, and they had to send it all the way to the team that had the top secret clearance. Not everybody can look at some of that stuff. And they opened up the box to determine what it was, and they found a top secret moldy sandwich that was actually encrusted into this box from the Vietnam era. Now, let me ask you something. If the U.S. government classifies a moldy sandwich as top secret and they don't know about it, do you think they may have overlooked some of the UFO data? Right? So this proved to me, wow, okay, the government doesn't really know what they have. The story behind it, though, is I think he was a colonel in the Army, was shot and killed, and 2 military policemen were ordered to go into his barracks, take everything off of his desk and everything like that, classify it, and ship it back to Washington for them to go through it. Problem is, no one went through it. So that shows you the problems to the U.S. government and their archives. At the JFK Library, I walked in, and the archivist knew I was coming. He was very helpful, very nice. There was nothing he did that was malicious or anything like that, and he really wanted to help, but he kind of, I walked in, and he says, oh, haha, you must be the History Channel producer, and you're searching for UFOs. And I went, yeah, I am. And he says, well, you're not going to find anything. And I said, oh, really? I said, well, I'm up for the challenge, and I just, like I say, he was a nice guy. He was joking around. He was being fun. I left with 200 photocopies of UFO-related material, most of which were letters to and from Bobby Kennedy. In 65, 66, and 67 were years that I found letters from Bobby Kennedy, about 160 of them. They were written to him about the importance of UFOs, but a couple stuck out. One of which is he was very skeptical. I mean, he was. In 66, he had type of a form letter response, or in 65, he had type of a form letter response. You know, he says, I received your inquiry on UFOs. He talks about how he doesn't believe that the Air Force is covering it up. I wish he was here today. But he says the Air Force wasn't covering it up. And he says that science, you know, is kind of pursuing it, but doesn't really know anything. But NICAP, as many of you know, the NICAP organization, was writing him letters too around this time. I found one from Dr. Frank Strange's, you know, and these are all the originals. So for me to go through this stuff, this is the stuff that Bobby Kennedy actually held in his hand. And I say that because in this one document, which I'll have with me, so if anybody wants to see it, they can, is that he would actually handwrite the response back, and his secretary would then type it up. So he actually cared enough to address this issue and not address it with a form-type response, where some of his letters were, but he would actually draft letters to the more important letters that he felt needed addressing. One of which was to a NICAP member saying, thank you for writing to me about your interest in UFOs. I've received several letters from other members of your group, and I'm keeping myself abreast of information developed on this subject. I appreciate your thoughtfulness in writing. So he obviously had an interest in it. This was just a couple years before the government ended their investigation on UFOs. But he obviously was still kind of keeping updated on it. But the gold mine for me was a document that was signed by Gerald Ford. Now, interestingly enough, all these documents, like I say, are original. Not many people say that they were able to touch the actual handwriting of Bobby Kennedy, and that's what I was actually able to do. And it's like, it's just kind of a surreal moment where you're looking at this document that you know he wrote on personally with his signature and everything. And like I said, I've got these up here, so if you want to see them, I'll put them out. On top of that, I also stumbled on an actual signature of JFK. And I'm telling you, I just was so in awe by it, because it's like, you know, I don't know what happened to him. I am fascinated by the movie and the subject matter, just like anybody else. But as I'm looking at it, you think to yourself, the man who signed this, what happened to you is why I do what I do. You know, I want the truth. And here was the signature by him. I just was like there for 5 minutes going, looking at it. And the archivist said, if you come across any handwriting, make sure you tag it, and we have to pull it, and it goes into the vault. Vault? I think they did call it the vault. Or the dark room, but they lock it up. You know, they don't let you touch it. So I actually started to mark it, and I'm going, no, I want to come back and get scans of these, so I stopped marking it. And I was so excited about stumbling across his signature, I forgot to get a photocopy of it. But I know exactly where it is, and I want to go back and actually scan it. But this is the work of going through archives, and you gotta, you know, you stumble across this awesome history behind it. But back to the Gerald Ford letter, John. It says, and I'll read the whole thing because I think it's very interesting. There was a letter that was sent to Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy turned around, I believe, from the best of my understanding, he forwarded it to Gerald Ford, congressman in 66, and he wanted Gerald Ford to respond. It was written to a guy by the name of Mr. Raymond G. Conley. Dear Mr. Conley, I wish to acknowledge and thank you for your recent letter enclosing the interview with Major Donald E. Kehoe regarding UFOs. As you know, I've expressed a good deal of concern about this problem and about my opinion that the American people are entitled to all of the facts on flying saucers. It is for this reason that I urged and continue to urge a congressional investigation. As you probably know, I wrote to the chairman of the two committees concerned and did all that I could to see that such a hearing was held. However, as you also know, we Republicans are outnumbered in the Congress by more than 2 to 1. Therefore, I cannot be as effective as I would like to be because we simply don't have the numbers. Your support for Republican candidates at the polls would be greatly appreciated because we are going to need backing if we are going to be successful in getting the UFO story told. Kindest personal regards, sincerely, Gerald Ford. So coming up with that for me was a gold mine. It's like we're not dealing with a captain in the Air Force. This is going to the congressional members. This is going to people who later become presidents, that they show concern of this. Doing research with Jeffrey here on UFOs in the White House, he and I are like the team on this. You know, we've got a lot of other people involved, you know, that get their name at the end of the thing, but all the research, 100% of it, including the writing and trying to determine the truth of all this stuff, is Jeffrey and I. So we've had our work cut out for us. He's been to the FDR library. We visited the Reagan library together. I've been to the JFK library. I'm going to the National Archives for 2 more days to find more stuff, see what I can get. It's been quite a unbelievable experience for me. Some of us talk about the Peter Jennings special and the ABC, and you've heard me talk about what Jeffrey and I want to accomplish with the media. And I always am surprised at some of the information that we come up with, you know, with dealing with the UFO research and so on. And I think it's interesting to point out that some say, well, the government was in collusion with ABC and you know, it was a hack job on the UFO community. And in many ways, it actually was. I mean, like I said, some of these guys were my friends. But I'm able to see the other side, coming from not the UFO community, but from the media. And I see the people that we have to answer to. And I see the things that they want us to do. And I see the problems that we have a great outline for a show. We have a section in there that's just brilliant. And then some guy who barely knows anything about UFOs, or some lady, she comes along and says, take that out. And we have to accommodate that. You know, we have to go through that. I call that the Peter Jennings effect. I think good old PJ had nothing to do with the project. I'm not siding with him, trust me. I just think he just said, nah, who cares, you know. You watch him read the script from the teleprompter. I don't even think he knew what the script was till he read it from that day when he was recording it. I just don't think he played a role in it. That leaves who? Well, that leaves the producers that come along that have absolutely no idea about the UFO community. And they're supposed to learn 55 years of research from multiple different people all in 6 months and do a 2-hour documentary about it. Of course, we're going to get people that don't know what they're doing and they put, you know, a horrible 2-hour documentary on TV. So I call that the Peter Jennings effect. Some call it conspiracy. I call it stupidity. I just don't believe. I think sometimes we give those Hollywood producers too much credit. You know, I don't think they're that smart. No offense. But, you know, I just think it's really just they for whatever reason, they have their own personal agenda. I've met some of these producers, and they really, you know, if they're skeptical, you see on screen their viewpoint. And that's what Jeffrey and I want to accomplish. We want to get out of the Peter Jennings effect where you have some guy come into the UFO community and in 6 months he thinks he knows everything and he does a 2-hour documentary on it and he thinks it's brilliant. But it's really not, because he doesn't have the passion for it. And that's why Jeffrey and I teamed up. UFOs is a very important issue, which I think we've all determined. We all come and join the UFO community, which I am proud to be a member of. And I actually have MUFON to thank for a lot of that, because they gave me the first speaking opportunity when I was 18 years old at the International Symposium, and Walt was still the director then. And that's when I first met him. So I appreciate MUFON's involvement in the UFO community, but also have to thank Walt and John and everybody for giving me that opportunity to speak. But in addition to UFOs, we want to deal with a lot of other information that you also don't hear about. You know, UFOs is one of my main passions of researching this stuff, but there's other things that I, you know, come across or see that I just can't understand, that the government is covering it up, and I really do feel that the American public has a right to know the historical record of the place we live. One of the things was a couple years ago, this Russian submarine Kursk went down. I don't know if any of you remember this. It was in the news. And something inside of me, so I don't know what it was, made me latch on to that. Because for some reason I wasn't in the Navy, I didn't do anything, but I latched on to this incident because I knew that these young kids were down there and they were just suffocating. They knew they were alive. They were tapping on the hull and everything. So while they were down there, I had Freedom of Information Act requests sitting in the Department of the Naval Headquarters on information relating to the incident while those guys were still banging on the hull, because I wanted to know what was going on. So why does this fit into Black Vault? Well, documentation and everything related to the incident is 100% classified. The reason why I took a hold of this is because the Russian government and military said that the US government brought it down. They were playing a cat and mouse game. They collided with the Russian submarine. It was crippled and it went down. This was the conspiracy theory that started to surface. Well, that's why I had these letters in the naval headquarters to try and figure it out. And they tell me, well, you know what, it's all classified. Well, I'd understand submarine data that from the Russian Navy is classified. I get that part of it. But there has to be something that they could release. So I was watching headlines all over the world. I was watching news agencies, governments, and everything. And the whole story was nothing on what they wanted you to believe. At the press statement, they said, whoa, wait, the U.S. government, we said, no, we don't have any submarines in the area. Documentation proves with other research that I've done through the Freedom of Information Act, just through different agencies, they had 3 submarines in the area. The Norwegian government reported that one of those 3 submarines that was in the area of the Kursk when it went down actually docked in a Norwegian port on a crippled basis that night. Why? Yet, nobody says anything about that. Media didn't report it. But the Russian government stood strong on saying, nope, the U.S. government played a role in this. So I continued following the developments and the raising of the Kursk. The Norwegian divers who got down there who were too late, you know, they were trying to do a rescue effort and it failed, reported a big dent in the front section of the hull with scrapes along the entire side, right? That was pretty much a collision. Yet the Russian government stood strong. The U.S. government denied all involvement. So as I'm watching this stuff go on, and years after, you know, I want to bring these documents to light because there's an interesting story here. If you look into history, we've collided on many occasions with Russian submarines. We just never killed 118 of them. So some ask me, well, why are they covering it up? Well, there's 118 reasons to cover it up. I mean, it's not obvious. There was actually one incident in the same water that the Kursk went down, that submarines actually went all the way towards each other and played a little cat and mouse game, and then at the last minute turned and actually scraped hulls along the entire side. And that's what they're doing down there. So these are the stories we want to tell. We want to profile these incidents that you don't hear about on Peter Jennings or the History Channel all the time. You know, we want to bring these out. And that's what the Black Vault television series is all about. I can go on for hours and hours and hours and tell you stories not only about UFOs, but this kind of material and secrets that will just blow your mind. And that's what the Black Vault is all about. So I appreciate your time. Thank you. And thank you. In multiple different subject matters that I deal with, but to kind of show you the raw evidence and show you the actual documents that the U.S. government really sends out. And the Black Vault was a website that I thought of almost 9 years ago. In August it will be 9 years, which has been quite a long trek, as you'll be able to see. So when I was asked to speak here and he said summarize those 9 years and prove the cover-up in 50 minutes, I laughed, you know, because there's just a massive amount of information to go through. So the archive was growing, and I was seeing the interest of the public growing in the subject of UFOs and government secrecy as a whole. To give you an idea, in March of '05, this year, I served over 266,000 people that actually came to the site to download information. Now that number proved to me, well over 250,000 people, that, hey, you know what, people want this information. You don't have to register, or the site's free, 100%. I didn't believe in charging to learn. So we have almost 30,000 people that voluntarily registered just to take part in a message forum, which is now approaching 400,000 posts of people communicating all over the world.
What's your URL?
It's called blackvault.com. 113 gigabytes for computer guys like me was downloaded that month, and it grows every month.
This is his first time at the X conference, but you'll probably see him again here for sure. He's going to get into some, again, very troubling, disturbing, disquieting things, and you'll probably need to take, some kind of sedative afterwards. But you understand, the truth is never, it's sometimes painful. So here, my good friend John Greenewald Jr. with some more truth for you.
What I want to do today is kind of take you on a little bit of a tour on what the U.S. government does say. As Steve mentioned, I created a website and an archive of documents to show not really my opinion on the subject of UFOs. If you ask me, I'm tripping over here, sorry, it's rather boring because the government summarizes from their research from 1947 to 1969, saying that this was their official explanation, and we know the story, that the government says there was nothing to UFOs. They've said that ever since. They summarized all those many years of research into a 2-page document. It's called the United States Air Force Fact Sheet. I bring this up in every lecture that I give because this is the basic fundamentals of their explanation. This is it. This is the end all. This is what they want you to believe. The stats in Project Blue Book and outlined in this fact sheet are the following: that they did over 12,600 sightings that they investigated. All but 701 were all identifiable. They were all Earth-based objects. They could easily explain them away, and we all know the infamous swamp gas story and how the planet Venus mysteriously streaks through the sky and makes a right-angle turn, which I learned probably wasn't possible, but the government said it was. All UFO investigations were stopped in 1969. This is key. This one line is the basic. This is the basis for my entire research. In 9 years, I used this fact sheet to say the government's lying. It's not hard. You can do that in a minute or two. But just showing the information in 50 minutes is where the difficulty comes in. The best statement of all in this fact sheet is they want you and me to believe that no government agency has ever taken an interest in UFO since the closure of Project Blue Book. And as you can see by the graph, I just threw that on there, that every month it gets higher. And that proved to me, you know what, people want this information. People want to know the truth behind UFOs. And that's what I want to accomplish, is kind of show you why. They see some of the documents that the government sends out. It's 100% legal. Anybody can do it. I wasn't anybody special who was able to get this information sent to me in an envelope secretly. This was something that I legally did, and the only difference between what I was trying to accomplish and many of the other requesters was I had to learn the very difficult game of being patient. Because if you're not patient, the U.S. government just loves that because you'll give up. And that was one of the hardest lessons for me to learn when I was 15. And I was still in high school trying to take on the CIA and the Pentagon, the FBI. And they quickly learned who I was because I would send out these Freedom of Information Act requests by 30 or 40 at a time. I would put them in the mail. So all of a sudden, the Pentagon would get 15 letters from me, you know, all requesting all sorts of different information. And as I was doing that, people were just coming in and just loving the information because most of it was never out before. When you deal with the government, you deal with a very basic explanation for what UFOs are. And it all begins with something we've heard a lot about called Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book is rather boring. This is it. This is what the government wants you to say. Anybody can get this. You just write them a letter. You can even give them a phone call and see what the truth is behind UFOs, and they'll send you this fact sheet, and they hope you'll give up. And back when I was 15 years old, I got this fact sheet, and I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. because some of the other documents I was starting to come in, that were starting to come into my mailbox, which were making my parents kind of nervous, but they were starting to flood in, was completely contradicting what the US government wanted me to believe. So this really, keep this in mind, keep this whole slide in mind. No government agency has ever taken an interest. I've dealt with subjects like nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, the secret testing of biological weapons on humans, some really secret and controversial stuff. It's actually harder for me to research and get UFO documentation than it is to get a nuclear bomb secret. Why is that? This is a little bit of an excerpt from the fact sheet that one agency actually went to the trouble to highlight other government agency. No other government agency. They were stressing this. And to me, it just further proved that they were trying, it was like they were setting themselves up to look bad. They were setting themselves up that they weren't telling the truth. You know, they said, hey, John, look over here, and they highlighted this statement. Yet I would get reams and hundreds of pages from another agency that completely contradicted it. You know, when I was very young, I didn't know the expression, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. When I was 15, I quickly learned